the one facility the IAEA has never been allowed to enter. In 60 years of conflict in the Middle East, no missile had ever reached it, until last night. 180 people injured, air defenses broken through, and the United Nations nuclear watchdog issued a statement that it has never issued about Israel in history. Something shifted last night, something that cannot be undone. And what happens next could change everything. Welcome back to the War 3 Signal, the one place where the real picture of this world's conflicts is laid out clearly, without noise, without agenda. Now, if you have been with this channel for some time, think of this subscribe button the way you think of a good newspaper you have trusted for decades. You would not let it stop arriving at your door. Do not let this channel disappear from your feed. Hit subscribe. Keep it there. And before we go further, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from today? Whether you are in London, Lahore, Lagos, or Los Angeles, let the world know you are paying attention. Now, let us get into what actually happened at Dimona. Iran struck Dimona. Not Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, not the air bases or the military command centers that this conflict had been targeting for 23 straight days. Dimona, a city in the southern desert of Israel, a city that most people watching this conflict had never heard of before last night. A city that sits in the Negev desert, far from the headlines, far from the cameras, far from the crowded streets where previous missile strikes had been landing for over 3 weeks. But Dimona is not just a city, and that is exactly why what happened last night is different from everything that came before it. Dimona is home to the Negev Nuclear Research Center, a facility that Israel built in the late 1950s with French technical assistance. Construction began in 1958. The reactor came online in the early 1960s. For over 6 decades since that day, the facility has been operating behind high fences, advanced security systems, and something even more powerful than both of those combined: official silence. Israel has never confirmed what is inside that facility. It has never denied it either. For 60 years, Israeli officials have looked the world in the eye and said nothing. Not a word. Not a confirmation. Not a denial. This policy has a name. It is called nuclear ambiguity. And it was designed with a very specific purpose. Every adversary must believe Israel has nuclear weapons. But Israel must never say it out loud. Because the moment Israel says it out loud, the international pressure begins. The treaty obligations arrive. The inspection demands multiply. So instead, Israel says nothing. And the silence does the work that words would make complicated. For 60 years, that silence held. The Negev Nuclear Research Center contains a reactor, intelligence assessments from multiple countries, technical analysis conducted over decades, and the direct testimony of Mordecai Vanunu, a former technician at the facility whose revelations were published in 1986, all point to the same conclusion. The facility contains a plutonium reprocessing plant. It contains nuclear weapons production infrastructure, and it is assessed by serious intelligence agencies around the world to house a stockpile of nuclear devices, estimated at somewhere between 80 and 400 warheads. Israel has confirmed none of this. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations body responsible for monitoring nuclear facilities worldwide, has been requesting access to Dimona for 60 years. It has never been permitted to enter. Israel has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is under no legal obligation to open its doors to IAEA inspectors. And so the inspectors have never walked through those doors. What exists inside Dimona is therefore officially unknown to the IAEA, officially unconfirmed by Israel, and unofficially understood by every government on the planet. For 23 days before last night, this conflict had been producing strikes against a specific vocabulary of targets: military assets, air bases, command facilities, intelligence infrastructure, the categories of target that wars produce when they are operating within certain boundaries. Dimona does not belong to that vocabulary. Dimona belongs to a different category entirely, a category that sits above everything else on the escalation ladder, a category that the world's governments, regardless of their position on this conflict, regardless of their alliances, regardless of their interests, are all designed to respond to in the same way. When Iranian missiles crossed into the airspace above southern Israel last night and came down in the city where that facility sits, they did not just strike a city. They crossed a line that 60 years of careful strategy had been constructed to keep uncrossable. 180 people were injured. Fences that had never been breached from the air in 60 years of Israel's nuclear history were suddenly inside the radius of a missile strike zone, and the silence that had protected Dimona since 1958. The silence that had survived inspection requests, international pressure, diplomatic confrontations, and 4 regional wars began, for the first time, to crack. The missiles did not get through by accident. That is the part that matters most. That is the part that changes the calculation for every military analyst, every defense planner, and every government official who woke up this morning and read the damage reports from Dimona. It was not luck. It was not a random failure. What happened over the skies of southern Israel last night was the product of 23 days of very specific, very deliberate, and very measurable degradation of one of the most advanced air defense systems ever built. And the people who fired those missiles knew exactly where that system was weakest. Israel's air defense network did not collapse overnight. In the opening days of this conflict, it was performing at close to 90% interception rates. Missiles were being knocked out of the sky at a rate that gave the Israeli public and the Israeli military a certain level of confidence. The system was working. The arrows were flying. The interceptors were doing what they were designed to do. But interceptors are not infinite. Every missile knocked out of the sky costs a missile from the inventory. And that inventory, across 23 days of sustained strikes, had been quietly shrinking. The resource allocation decisions that followed were logical. They were also consequential. Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, the central population corridors where the majority of Israel's 9 million people live. These were the priority zones. These were where the remaining interceptor inventory was concentrated. Southern Israel paid the price for that prioritization. The Negev to Arad or Beersheba. The cities of the south sat in what analysts now describe as the coverage shadow. Not undefended entirely, but defended at a level that assumed the south was not the primary target. That assumption held for 22 days. It did not hold on day 23. Iran did not send simple ballistic missiles in a straight line toward southern Israel. The specific variants deployed in last night's wave were maneuvering warheads. The K-Bar Shekan and Ahmad variants that Iran has been rotating into recent strike packages carry warheads that adjust their flight path during descent. They do not fall in a predictable arc. They move, they shift, they force the intercept geometry to recalculate in real time. Against a fully stocked, fully operational air defense network, that capability is manageable. Against a degraded southern coverage architecture operating at the end of a 23-day attrition campaign, that capability becomes something else entirely. The interception rate that had opened this conflict at 90% had declined to somewhere between 70 and 75% by the time last night's strike wave arrived. Against a multi-missile salvo, targeting multiple southern locations simultaneously, stressing the remaining coverage architecture at its weakest point. That percentage produces a very specific outcome. Some missiles get through. Last night, some missiles got through to Dimona. Within hours of the strike, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued an emergency statement. 2 sentences, each one carrying a different kind of weight. The first sentence said the IAEA had not received any indication of damage to the nuclear research center in the Negev. That sentence was meant to reassure, but its existence did the opposite. Emergency statements are not issued about facilities that were not threatened. The IAEA confirmed that the question of damage was serious enough to require an official response. That confirmation is itself the alarm. The second sentence was something the world had never heard before in the context of Israeli nuclear policy. The IAEA's Director General called for maximum military restraint to be observed, in particular in the vicinity of nuclear facilities. Read that sentence carefully. The IAEA does not call for military restraint near facilities that do not exist. It does not issue nuclear protection statements about uninhabited desert. It issues those statements about nuclear facilities. And it just issued one about Dimona. For 60 years, the IAEA had maintained institutional silence about what sits behind those fences in the Negev desert. Inspection requests had gone unanswered. Official acknowledgments had never been made. Last night, Iranian missiles accomplished what 6 decades of diplomatic pressure could not. They forced the IAEA to treat Dimona as exactly what it is. A nuclear facility, requiring protection, requiring restraint, requiring the specific language that the world reserves for the most dangerous category of target on Earth. The silence did not survive the missiles. Iran did not miss. That is the first thing to understand about last night. Before the damage assessments, before the diplomatic statements, before the emergency meetings and the carefully worded responses from capitals around the world, Iran did not miss. The missiles that struck Dimona were not aimed at the reactor. They were aimed near it, close enough to injure 180 people, close enough to force an IAEA emergency statement, close enough to make every government on the planet hold its breath for several hours while damage reports were being compiled, but not close enough to hit what sits behind those fences directly. That distance, the space between where the missiles landed and where the reactor stands, is not a margin of error. It is a message. To understand why Iran chose Dimona specifically, the timeline must be read in its correct order. Israel had previously struck Iranian nuclear infrastructure, facilities that Iran had spent years building, infrastructure that sits at the center of Iran's own strategic deterrence calculations. Iran's response was not random. It was not emotional. It was constructed with a very specific logic that mirrors the action it was responding to. You struck our nuclear facility. We can strike yours. The symmetry is deliberate, the message is explicit, and it operates on 2 levels at the same time. At the tactical level, it is a proportionality claim. Iran is communicating to the world that its response matches what was done to it, that the exchange formula is being maintained, that Iran is not escalating beyond what it received. At the strategic level, it is something far more serious. It is a deterrence demonstration. Iran just told Israel, the United States, and every government watching this conflict that it knows where Israel's nuclear program is located, that its missiles can reach it, that Israel's air defense system, the system that was supposed to make Dimona untouchable, could not stop them, and that the restraint Iran showed last night was a choice, not a limitation. That choice is the most important detail of this entire strike. Iran could have targeted the reactor directly. The missiles had the range, the warheads had the maneuvering capability, the southern coverage gap was wide enough. Instead, Iran struck the city. It injured people in buildings. It created damage that cameras could film and reporters could describe. It did not touch the reactor. The restraint visible in that distance between impact sites and the facility's location is Iran's communication about what comes next if Israel continues escalating. It is Iran telling Israel that the next escalation does not have to look like last night. It can look like something considerably worse. Hit our power plants, and we stop being careful about what we hit near yours. Now consider what that communication means in physical terms. Because the IAEA Director General's call for maximum restraint near nuclear facilities was not abstract diplomatic language. It was a warning grounded in a very specific understanding of what Dimona contains and what happens if its containment is breached. A missile strike on a nuclear research reactor does not produce a nuclear explosion. Reactors are not weapons. But the risk from a direct strike on Dimona is not a nuclear explosion. The risk is radiological, and in some ways, that risk is harder to manage than the explosion itself. 60 years of fuel cycle operations at the Negev Nuclear Research Center have produced a significant inventory of radioactive material, spent fuel, processed waste, operational byproducts, accumulated across 6 decades of continuous operation. A strike that breached the facility's containment would not level a city in a single moment. It would release that inventory into the air above the Negev Desert. And the Negev Desert is not empty. Beersheba, Israel's 4th largest city, sits 35 kilometers from Dimona. The surrounding Negev region carries a significant population. Wind patterns in that desert do not stay local. A radiological release from a damaged Dimona facility would not remain in the desert. It would move with the wind, across populated areas, across borders, into air that people breathe and water that people drink. Netanyahu visited the impact sites. He stood in Dimona. He spoke about a difficult evening. He condemned the targeting of civilian areas. He said nothing about the facility. He did not mention the reactor. He did not reference the IAEA statement. He did not address the question that every nuclear analyst on the planet was asking within minutes of the missile's landing. He could not. Because to describe the threat to the facility is to confirm the facility exists. To reassure the Israeli public that the reactor is intact is to confirm there is a reactor. 60 years of nuclear ambiguity does not allow for that sentence to be spoken, even when Iranian missiles have just landed in the city where the reactor stands. Netanyahu's silence, standing in Dimona after the strike, was the most precise possible expression of a policy that has survived everything this conflict has thrown at it. Everything except the IAEA statement that came after he left. 4 facts happened on the same day. Dimona was struck. The IAEA issued a nuclear statement about Israel. Trump postponed the power plant strikes. Oman began mediating at the highest urgency this conflict has yet produced. Those 4 facts are not a coincidence. They are a sequence. And that sequence tells the story of where this conflict stands this morning more clearly than any single statement from any single government has managed to tell it. Read them in order, understand what connects them, and the picture that forms is the most significant strategic development this war has produced in 23 days of fighting. On the same day that Iranian missiles struck Dimona, the President of the United States issued an ultimatum via social media. The language was direct. The threat was specific. Iran was given 48 hours to fully open the Strait of Hormuz, or face strikes on its power plants. The words used were obliterate, starting with the biggest one first. That ultimatum was issued in the morning. By evening, Iranian missiles had landed in the city where Israel's nuclear program is located. The timing is not accidental. Iran's parliament speaker stated clearly that if power plants and critical energy infrastructure were targeted, the response would be irreversible. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the Strait of Hormuz would be completely shut down. And on the same day those warnings were delivered in words, Iran delivered a separate warning in missiles to Dimona. The message being sent to Washington was the same message being sent to Jerusalem, just addressed to a different decision-maker. You threatened our power plants. We demonstrated what our response looks like. We showed you where our missiles can reach. We showed you that Israel's air defense cannot reliably stop them. And we showed you that we chose not to hit the reactor directly. This time, the 48-hour ultimatum expired. The power plant strikes did not happen. Trump announced a 5-day postponement. The postponement was announced after Dimona was struck, not before. That sequence matters more than any official explanation of why the postponement happened. The missiles that reached Dimona changed the calculation in Washington. The IAEA does not need to spell that out. The timeline already did. Russia and China read that timeline too. Russia's emergency communication to the United Nations Security Council following the Dimona strikes used language that Russia had not used at any previous point in this conflict. Russia described the situation as creating conditions for catastrophic escalation beyond any previous threshold. It called for an immediate ceasefire as the only mechanism capable of preventing a nuclear dimension to this conflict. Notice the specific word Russia chose. Not humanitarian, not economic, not strategic, nuclear. Russia understands what every government understands, but most have been careful not to say directly. The humanitarian argument for ceasefire did not stop this war. The economic disruption argument did not stop it. The oil price argument, the ammunition depletion argument, the civilian casualty argument, none of them produced the ceasefire that the diplomatic track had been attempting to build for 3 weeks. The nuclear argument is different. The nuclear argument lands on every government simultaneously with the same urgency, regardless of their position on everything else. It does not matter where a government stands on the origins of this conflict. It does not matter which side has their sympathy or their arms shipments or their diplomatic cover. When the word nuclear enters the conversation in an operational rather than theoretical context, every government responds the same way. China confirmed that pattern immediately. China convened an emergency session of its National Security Council, specifically addressing the Dimona situation. It issued a formal statement calling for immediate de-escalation and the resumption of ceasefire negotiations under United Nations auspices. China's statement specifically cited the risk of nuclear facility damage as requiring the immediate cessation of all military operations in the conflict zone. 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council on the same day using the nuclear argument pushing for the same ceasefire. That has not happened before in this conflict. Now consider what Dimona being struck means for every calculation that follows from this morning forward. It means Israeli air defense over southern Israel cannot reliably protect the city where Israel's nuclear research center is located. The architecture that was supposed to make Dimona untouchable has been degraded to the point that Iranian missiles reached the city, injured 180 people, and forced an IAEA emergency nuclear statement. That is not a near miss contained by a functioning defense system. That is a successful penetration of the geographic space that Israeli nuclear security was built across 60 years to keep outside the range of any adversary's weapons. It means Iran has established a deterrence capability that did not exist in this conflict's opening days. Not the capability to destroy Dimona, the capability to reach it. The distinction between those two things is the entire communication. Reach without destruction is a threat held in reserve. It is Iran telling every decision-maker watching that the next escalation can look different from last night if the escalation justifies it. It means the ceasefire conversation has acquired the one argument that all previous versions of the conversation were missing. Oman is mediating. The channels are open. The urgency is real. And the reason the urgency is real is sitting in the damage reports from a city in the Negev desert that most people had never heard of before last night. The missiles that hit Dimona did not damage the reactor, but they damaged something that 60 years of military strength, diplomatic maneuvering, and institutional silence had kept completely intact. They damaged the assumption that Dimona was unreachable. That assumption was the foundation of Israel's nuclear deterrence posture. It was the unspoken guarantee that sat beneath 60 years of nuclear ambiguity. It was the reason the silence worked, because behind the silence stood the belief that no adversary could reach what the silence was protecting. Last night, Iranian missiles reached it. 180 people were injured. The IAEA issued a nuclear statement about Israel for the first time in history. A 48-hour ultimatum was quietly postponed for 5 days, and Oman began working the phones at a pace that this conflict had not previously required. The city Israel never officially confirmed contains what everyone knows it contains. The facility the IAEA spent 60 years trying to inspect. The program that nuclear ambiguity spent 6 decades protecting from official acknowledgement. Iranian missiles reached it last night without warning, without interception, and without the consequences that everyone assumed would prevent exactly this moment from ever arriving. That is where this conflict stands this morning. And the question that no government is saying out loud is whether the next escalation finds the same restraint that last night's missiles chose to show.